So, without further ado, I want to introduce your panelists for today. Both of them senior people at PCX, and I think you'll be able to learn a lot from them. So, the first is our CEO, Sebastian DeGrande. And Sebastian is the CEO of PCX, and he has over 35 years of deep experience building and leading global teams to deliver impact at scale. He spent 20 years at the Boston Consulting Group in San Francisco, London, and Sydney, leading the technology practice, and followed this up with several years leading an 5 million plus global digital and international business at the Gap. He joined PCX really to apply his experience to a mission that he felt passionate about, cleaning up plastic waste globally, and to help lead the change in the fight to protect nature from plastic waste. Second up is Russell Davis. He's the head of products and services at PCX, and he has over 15 years of experience in sustainability, business operations, and design. He's deeply committed to building market efficient circular solutions. His career journey began at the Boston Consulting Group after earning an MBA at Darden. And he worked closely with Bill McDonough. Many of you may know his Cradle to Cradle book. And Russell worked in design for circular economy and thought leadership with McDonough Foundation. So let's get started, everybody. And thank you again for coming. Over to you, Sebastian.
Great. Thanks, Lise. Thanks for the kind intro. So we're gonna get quite deeply into the discussion here on US EPR and how to navigate it. But I'm gonna do just a quick setup of the context, the broader global context within which all of you are trying to navigate US EPR. So as many of you will know, there has been an ongoing effort, and actually there's yet again another meeting in Geneva happening soon to formulate and agree on and align on a global plastic treaty. I myself have attended virtually all of these meetings over the last 4 or 5 years. It is both energizing and, to be honest, quite frustrating to watch this process of trying to get about 180 countries to align on a set of common harmonized rules and regulations for chemicals of concern, for single-use plastics, etc. The reality, the objective reality is it has not happened. The hope was there would be a signing ceremony about a year ago. There's been obviously some macro changes in politics and policy that have really left us with no foundational global treaty to harmonize regulation globally, which is the bad news. The good news is that as a result or in parallel, we are still seeing a lot of individual countries around the world. This little map at the bottom starts to highlight it, as well as individual jurisdictions like the states in the US, effectively saying, well, if there's not going to be a global treaty for us to align with, then we're going to come up with our own rules. Obviously, Europe was well ahead of the game on this. They are also now updating and trying to harmonize within Europe. But you see it in Southeast Asia, you see it in Latin America, et cetera. You're seeing these EPR laws go into effect. But the challenge with that is they are all somewhat different. They are different in terms of their objectives. Are they trying to optimize and maximize the use of recycled material or investment in infrastructure for recycled material? Are they simply trying to focus on reduction? Are they simply trying to raise funding or use fees as a way to disincentivize the use of plastic and other types of packaging materials? The mechanisms they use are very different. The reporting requirements vary. And you're going to see this in a microcosm in what we discuss and what Russell's going to go through in the US. And all of this, including, as it mentions here, materials and scope, leads to a really complex environment to navigate. And you know, I often hear from people, well, companies really don't, they're resisting delivering impact and doing the right thing. And I completely disagree. We are members of the Business Coalition, and the Business Coalition is all the representatives of the large CPG companies are members of the business coalition, and they're prepared to take real meaningful action. What they're asking for is just give me one set of rules to adhere by so that I don't have to figure out how to do different things in different jurisdictions. Unfortunately, that's where we are right now. And so it's critically important to understand how to navigate all of this, and that's really the context for this conversation. So let's keep going. By the way, we'll say this over and over again. Please, if you have questions throughout the session, feel free to post them in the Q&A section here. We will reserve a good block of time at the end of the presentation to start addressing those questions. So feel free to start posting them now and throughout, and then we'll start addressing those questions as we get into it. So just a quick add here and why we feel we can be helpful. PCX has been around for quite a long time and started as a nonprofit in the Philippines, but now has a very global footprint. And as Lise mentioned, we drive impact in 15 countries around the world. We are, through our PCX Solutions team, which is our sister organization, we are an official observer to the UNEP global treaty process. We're even involved in the negotiations through the Philippine delegation. We are active members of the Prevent Waste Alliance. We are actually a PRO in the Philippines. We're a registered PRO submitting compliance documentation on behalf of over 100 partners there. So we are involved in a lot of different organizations and have done a lot of publication, and we've worked with a lot of NGOs and others to really go deep on not just where the policy is, but where it's headed, and to even influence that as much as we possibly can in the right direction. Let's keep going. So let's start shifting to the US discussion here. Overall, what is EPR? Most of you are probably quite familiar with extended producer responsibility as a concept, but it's important to understand why it's there. The idea fundamentally and philosophically and structurally is to try to shift the cost of managing packaging waste from taxpayers and municipalities who, in the US at least, we have, municipal infrastructure for collection and processing, but all of these things cost money, and trying to shift some of that cost to the producers away from taxpayers and to have that funding directed towards better outcomes for that packaging waste. So how it works at a very high level, and Russell's going to get into this in much greater detail, is essentially a producer has to register, and we'll talk about the definition of producer and the characteristics of that in a moment. But a producer has to register with a producer responsibility organization or a PRO who is officially certified and accredited to provide that service in a given jurisdiction, a state or a country. They have to report their packaging data. In many cases, that packaging data has to be verified, sometimes with a third-party audit, sometimes not, or self-reported, and then ultimately pay fees associated with the mix of packaging materials that are being utilized by that business. And again, that varies greatly by state, which we will get into. Again, why is it there? Many reasons and objectives. One, to reduce overall packaging waste, to ensure we're funding the right infrastructure around recycling infrastructure, things like that, increase the amount of recycled content or even alternative materials that are being used, and to really incentivize a focus on long-term improvement in overall packaging design with the best possible environmental outcomes. And again, I'm not going to get into this because Russell's going to get into it himself. But as you look at this state by state, there are so many variables that are different. What's in scope? Who's the PRO? What's the fees and malices that are attached to the different packaging types and by unit or weight, components even, what have you. So we're going to get into that in much greater detail. But at a high level, these are the things you need to consider when addressing EPR in the US. So with that, let me hand off to Russell. And again, I'll just encourage you, as we're talking, feel free to post those questions. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you, Sebastian. And with that, let's get into it. So let's start by talking about where is EPR. It's in lots of places, many countries. It's in Canada. Today, our discussion is going to focus on the US. And here on the map, you can see the states that are the most advanced in terms of EPR legislation. All the green states have laws that have passed. They're in varying states of implementation, and we'll get into more of that in a moment. But there's a couple of key takeaways that I want to highlight before we get started. One is that there's no national framework. And so that means that the laws are going to vary a little bit state to state. That is both in how you report, that is in what materials are in scope, what the exclusions are, what producers are included or excluded, and what the fees are. So very many changes from state to state, and the implementation varies state to state. We've seen some consolidation in terms of your PRO reporting, so who you will report through. In most cases in the US, it's the Circular Action Alliance, and that's gaining steam as well. And some of the newer states that are coming out, they're very active in their policy engagement. Well, less so in policy engagement, but more so in becoming the PRO for many of these states. And there's more states on the way as well. We'll also get into that. So who is the producer in the US? This distinction matters a lot because the producer is the person or the organization that must be reporting the packaging and paying the fees. Typically, the producer is defined according to this hierarchy. It's a little different state to state, but this is pretty consistent. It's one of the points of pretty good harmonization. It's usually the brand owner. So if a brand, has branded products, they're going to market and they're manufacturing those products or hiring a third-party contract manufacturer to make them on their behalf, where the brand is the one that's making the packaging decisions, they're going to be the producer with a capital P. If that producer doesn't exist in a state, there's oftentimes a brand licensee who is selling the products under their own license. And if the brand owner isn't there, it's going to fall to the brand licensee. This is also very applicable in other jurisdictions, especially in emerging markets where there's local organizations that are licensing brands from global brand owners. The brand licensee is going to be the obliged party in most of those countries. And then finally, if none of those things are met, it's the first seller distributor of the packaging that's brought into the state. This is kind of a catch-all. If the brand isn't there, someone is going to be responsible. And so this last category is largely defined with a broad net. But in most cases, it's going to be the brand owner, and it'll be pretty straightforward. So what is covered in state packaging EPR laws? On the left, we have a list of states here, and this maps to the map we looked at earlier. These are the ones with the most advanced laws. They've passed. There's some amount of clarity in terms of what the legislation requires. All of these states are regulating packaging. We're talking about packaging EPR here. We're not talking about textiles or batteries or many of these other types of products. Usually food service ware is in scope. There are some variations, like California is like only really looking at plastic. And in some states, paper products are in scope as well. This is still a burden in terms of reporting, but the paper tends to be a little less expensive for producers, so less impactful financially at least. But packaging is the core item here, as well as food serviceware, as food serviceware is a very visible point of consumption and pollution. You see it, on the street in places where there is litter and pollution. An example of this would be, plastic straws. That gets a lot of negative publicity. There are exemptions. These aren't the specific exemptions, but more so the general categories of exemptions that you can expect. The first one is small producers. Small companies typically don't have to report or do anything. Typically, if your revenue within a state is under $1, $2, or $5 million, that varies by state, you would be an excluded producer. There's also tonnage thresholds as well. That's typically under 1 ton, and most states have that as well. Secondly is material that's covered under other laws. The most visible example of this is the can deposit laws that are in many states. Many of the EPR programs exclude that material because it's already being managed and funded under existing laws. The third category is federally regulated products. These are drugs, hazardous materials, some specialty products. These are often covered under other laws already. So they're typically exempted from packaging EPR laws. And then some B2B packaging. It depends on the state if B2B packaging is covered or not, but some packaging is going to be excluded here. This list is not exhaustive. It's more of a category and a way to think about it, but this is what's typically exempted. One point I do want to make is that even if you are a small producer, you are unsure if you need to register or not. Typically, you should be registering, but categorizing yourself as exempt. Because you might not be exempt in the future, and should you cross the threshold sometime in the future, you want to have already been registered as exempt. This is a deeper dive into packaging exemptions by state. It's a bit of a summary, and of course, you need to understand the more specific exemptions, but this is generally how it works. Same list of states on the left, and the same categorization on the previous page. Beverage containers typically are exempt if they are under other laws, but Maryland, Minnesota, Washington, those programs haven't come into full force yet, but those are looking less like they're going to be exempt. Long-term storage protection, while this still might constitute some type of single-use packaging, if it doesn't have the high turnover that, immediate use short-term packaging has, sometimes it's exempt. Infant formula and specialty products like that are sometimes exempt. Packaging for FDA regulated products, drugs, devices, that is typically exempt. And then packaging for regulated products. These are, if you don't know, these are like insecticides and things like that. Very specific niche things. These are often exempted as well. But broadly, all packaging is in scope with the exception of some exemptions that are here. Just a quick look at PRO compliance by state. So these 7 states are the ones that are the most advanced in terms of their legislation. And the PRO across most of these is probably going to be CAA. CAA has already been selected by some of the states. It's probably going to be a PRO in the balance of the states. And so this is who you're probably going to need to be reporting through. There are a few PRO alternatives, but it tends to be difficult to do. Like, for example, in California, there is a way to not report through CAA, but it's narrow and difficult. And you still have to report some data through CAA anyway. So it's not really a great path for most companies. And then other states like Colorado and Washington, you have to get direct approval from the state for you to, not work through the PRO. Registration in many of these states is past due. So if you haven't done it, you should register for these states. And for the other ones, it's coming up. So you need to be acting on this already. And the full program reporting has started for California, Colorado, and Oregon. The others are coming up soon. Some of these will also have early reporting and early fees, which isn't characterized completely here on the slide. But these programs are coming into effect. But the takeaway is for all states in the US, registering and reporting through CAA is going to be your best path. And it's going to give you a little bit of harmonization, how you report, what's the interface, who do you ask questions to, things like that. So we talked about those 7 states, but that's not all. There's active legislation happening in other states right now. New York, New Jersey, Illinois, Hawaii, Tennessee, New Hampshire all have bills that are being discussed in their various state legislatures at the moment. They tend to be relatively similar to some of the existing models that are out there, which is great from a harmonization standpoint. So some things might be similar, but we still expect some differences within the states and how you report, and especially when you get into the weeds for things like what the exemptions are, in the material categorization when you go to report, One that I want to highlight is the bill in New York. It has super high ambition. It's similar to California in many ways, and there's some discussion of a source reduction requirement there as well, which is the most ambitious aspect of California's law as well. Here are the three states that are most advanced: California, Colorado, Oregon. Colorado, all three have had data that's been due to be reported already. All three have, well, California hasn't had any fees due yet, but it's coming. But the main points I'm going to highlight on this slide is why you need to register. There are potential fines for these three states, and these are outlined in the legislation. It's not a rule imposed by CAA. These are state laws. Producers that aren't compliant are subject to fines. The exact enforcement mechanisms and the number of notices is to be announced by many of these states, but the fines are clearly outlined in the laws. There's a few penalties that producers could face if they aren't compliant. The first one is, of course, the fines, but there's also legal actions, restrictions on product sales. You could be pushed out of a state if you aren't compliant for long enough. Reputational and ultimately investor and retailer scrutiny, as those other organizations need to be compliant as well. And then for Circular Action Alliance members, there is an interest rate. Circular Action Alliance collects the fees and distributes them back to the state. There is an interest rate if you are late on fees, and if you wait to register, let's say you register in 2030, like you wait a few years, but it turns out you were an obliged producer all the way back from the start. You will be required to backdate your tonnage and pay fees on that. So you'll be hit with a lump payment of multiple years of EPR fees when you do register. So please, please, please register and stay on top of this. It's super important to be thinking about this and acting on it this year if you haven't done it already. Next, we're going to talk a little bit more about California. It is like the other states, but it has some additional requirements and some additional goals that make it a little bit unique. So SB 54 is the law in California. It was passed back in 2022. So it's been around for a long time now, and implementation is just starting now. There's a number of 10-year goals. So 2024 up through 2032, when you count back when it was passed as well, many things that happen over the initial implementation period outlined in the legislation. And it applies to all the packaging sold in California. There are a few exemptions we looked at earlier, but generally all the packaging is going to be in scope. And there's even some breaking news on this, some clarification from CalRecycle, the regulator, of what's in scope, and they have made it relatively narrow and harder to get some of these exemptions. Why do they have the law? To cut waste, boost recycling, and shift that funding responsibility to the producers. The same thing Sebastian outlined earlier. The main impacts on the producers is that through CAA as the PRO must collectively reach these goals. Plastic weight by 2032 must be reduced by 25% from the 2023 baseline. Also applies to plastic components. This is unique to California, reporting plastic components, counting those, and reducing those. 65% of single-use plastic needs to be recycled in practice in California by 2032. Super ambitious goal. CalRecycle just came out with some estimated recycling rates earlier this year, or it might have been the end of 2025. And it's, single digits, the current recycling rate for many of these plastics. And then also 100% of packaging must be classified as recyclable or compostable by 2032 as well. CAA has had many webinars, many goals, or many discussions on how they intend to invest in infrastructure with the fees they collect to make formats that are currently non-recyclable, recyclable in California. It's unclear and ambitious, like how exactly they're going to meet these targets, and what the threshold of proof is going to be there, but it's in the legislation. It's very important that your packaging is headed towards a recyclable or compostable format. The on the right, some of the things that producers have to be thinking about, hitting these recyclability and reuse targets, funding recycling through the fees. That's the same as Colorado and Oregon and the other states, to be honest. And then annual reporting and compliance. The unique thing that we're going to spend a couple of minutes on here is the 25% plastic source reduction by 2032 requirement. Unique to California, maybe New York's going to do something like this, but very important for companies and may become very impactful as well, which we'll get to in a second. So some of the latest news coming out on SB 54. January 30th, so just last week, CalRecycle published some draft regulations. What this means is, well, they had published some regulations, they had withdrawn those regulations, made a few updates, and just re-released them. So CAA should have its final set of regulations for which to make its program plan. There are a number of small things that changed in it, but the most impactful one is for food producers. Exemptions for food packaging were narrowed. There were some exemptions in there before that could be interpreted as categorical exemptions, and those have been significantly narrowed with a higher burden of proof that producers will have to prove that there's no alternatives. It's the only health and safety option. It's mandated by the federal government, things like that. The burden's pretty high, so our takeaway is that most of the food packaging that maybe could have been exempted is not going to be exempted. So if you're a food producer, you need to be understanding exactly what this means for you. What's next here is there's a 15-day public comment period. CalRecycle is taking the public comments. They're only accepting written submissions. If this is something that you or your legal partners want to submit lobbying or public comments on, it's time to do it now. The window is pretty short, which is expected given how close the implementation of the program is. This will give us a couple things. Collectively, this is going to give CAA more clarification on regulations as it prepares its program plan, which is due in June. And this is the outline of how CAA intends to enforce the program over the next 10 years. All the ins and outs of how that's going to work. The state is going to review it and approve it later in 2026. And it should give further clarity for producers on some of the final regulations as they prepare to submit 2025 data in May. This is most impactful for food producers, as we mentioned a second ago. One thing I do want to highlight is we have a series of webinars that we put on, and the next one coming up is all about source reduction. We're going to talk a little bit about that here, specific to California, but our next one is going to be source reduction in California for SB 54, but also going to include some global benchmarks, how companies are implementing this in practice, whether it's voluntary or through regulatory requirements. So you can scan this. We'll have another QR code later, or if you got an email from us, you should expect to get another one promoting this. So source reduction, how does it work? The most important thing to remember with this is your 2023 baseline is set, and you must reduce compared to that static number. If your growth is probably going to push your reduction target beyond 25%, vary a little bit based on what type of packaging you're in or if your business is growing or not. But let's get into what that means. So I'm going to use my mouse here. So this green area here, this is the reduction target. So 100% in 2023, down to 75% in 2032. This is the absolute source reduction that's mandated by law in California. Sorry, CAA has further clarified that there is no adjustment for business growth or unit growth or economy growth. It's a static target that must be reduced against. And with that, there are some targets outlined in the legislation. So there are some reduction targets of getting up to 25%, and then reuse, refill, and elimination targets that are also outlined with the legislation as well. Those interim targets are, outlined here on the page. The complication for businesses here is the blue section. If your business is growing at, say, a reasonable, 3 to 4% per year, kind of in line with the economy, that's going to push your business as usual growth. If you're not going to make any changes to your packaging, keep it the same as it is today, higher. This is what it would be projected in 2032, which means that your actual source reduction target versus what it was going to be, if you did nothing, is more like 40 to 50%. So super important to get your head around this, start making plans to make changes, and the impact of this we'll explain in a couple of minutes of like financially how might this hit companies. We don't know for sure, but we can certainly provide some insight here. The CAA made a number of announcements related to source reduction, and I'll run through a few of them. The first one is caps with malice. Caps being the targets for the 25%, reducing over time as outlined on the previous slide. They said that malice fees must meaningfully increase the cost of exceeding targets. Our read on this is that source reduction goals are going to be very expensive if they can't be hit by a company. Meaningfully increase the cost of exceeding targets. See what that means when the malice and cap rates come out. They haven't been published by CAA yet, but we expect these to be pretty steep. The individual source reduction plans still net out to 25%. So within California for CAA, every company will have their individual source reduction plan, and CAA as a whole, as the PRO, is responsible for the 25% reductions in both weight and components. There have been lots of questions about, what about me? Like, does my source reduction plan need to be 25%? Because of whatever factor, maybe mine should be less than 25%. And that could be true. CAA hasn't outlined this yet, but they have directly said that the market as a whole through all of CAA has to net out to 25%. So if someone is less than 25%, somebody else is going to have to be more. The methodology for this hasn't come out yet, but you should expect your target to be 25% as a round number. Maybe it'll be a little higher or lower. There's no adjustment for growth. We covered that on the previous slide. So any sales or unit growth on average needs to be net non-plastic or maybe even plastic negative. The reporting nuances on this also haven't come out, ongoing developments. There's alternative compliance with PCR. So of the 25 percentage points of reduction that need to happen, up to 8 of those 25 percentage points can come from increased use of PCR. There will be some sort of formula that'll calculate this, and some of the ongoing developments are, the methodology for that formula and which certifications or designations from PCR are acceptable. There is one certification outlined in the legislation, but there are others that could be accepted as well. But we're waiting for ongoing news on that. Prior reduction credit is probably not going to be attainable for most producers. There's a provision in the law that requires CAA to give credit or recognition to companies that have made meaningful reductions between 2013 and 2022. CAA has made it clear that an absolute reduction is required. So if you've increased your amount of plastic at all between 2013 and 2022, you probably aren't going to get credit. Even if you reduced your plastic per unit by 25%, but your units grew 75%, you're going to have a net increase of plastic regardless of those individual reductions. And so in that scenario, you're probably not going to get credit. The exact calculation methodology hasn't come out yet, so let's stay posted and see what happens. Shifting to non-recyclable doesn't count. So a legacy way of reducing is moving from heavier weight, maybe rigid formats, into flexible formats. Well, right now those flexible formats aren't counted as recyclable in California. So reductions that move from a recyclable format to a non-recyclable format don't count against your goals. The ongoing definition of which of those flex formats are deemed recyclable and by what date is ongoing. So there may be some relief there over time, but it's still unclear. Complex reporting. So CAA has talked about having to report on the 5 reduction pathways. We'll cover this in our next source reduction webinar, like what exactly are those pathways and how do they work and how do you report on them. But some of the specific templates and methodologies are yet to come out. And finally, super innovative thing CAA announced, trading, like a cap and trade from carbon or the historical like acid rain cap and trade that the EPA did back in the 80s. Never been applied to plastic before. It might happen here. So it presents an opportunity to recoup investments if you're able to source reduce beyond your reduction targets. The time, the methodology for that trading, and what the financial rewards might be are still unclear, but really innovative thing coming from CAA on this. First in the world of talking about cap and trade for plastic production into the market. What do the fees for this look like and how might it impact your business? So on the left here, we have graphically identified, what are the various fee categories. The scale of this is illustrative, so don't take too much weight in that. But the CAA base fees, typical across other states. These other 4 categories, unique to California's source reduction goals. The first one being the cap malus. This is probably going to be the biggest financial impact, likely annually recurring. And I mean, CAA said they must meaningfully increase the cost of exceeding targets would lead to the biggest financial impact if missed. The takeaway here is business as usual in terms of the amount of plastic that's embedded in the packaging going to California. It's probably going to need to change for companies or it's going to get more and more expensive. Maybe that'll work for your business, maybe it won't. Base fees, similar to other states. RRE malus, again, that's reuse, refill, and elimination. There were targets outlined in the legislation for how far you have to progress on this year over year, or at least like every few years there's a target. CAA has implied there's going to be penalties for missing this. They have to meet targets collectively as a PRO, so it makes sense that those targets would collectively, filter down to the constituent companies. Next is trading. Talked a little bit about how innovative this was on the last page, but it could have a triple compounding ROI. And let me explain that for a second. The first is if you are able to reduce beyond your reduction targets, you will reduce your fees, your base fees. You will avoid the malus, and then you can possibly sell those credits back to the market. And then finally, there are some bonuses. We don't know exactly what these are. CAA has talked about it. We're not sure how big they'll be in comparison to the base fees, but really interesting. So that was a quick on source reduction. Check out our next webinar if you want to know more. Let's get back to overall packaging EPR strategy. What do you need to be doing? You need to be building a strategy for how to do it. And these are the 4 main areas that we think most companies should be thinking about. The first one is data systems. So you need a baseline to establish systems and track progress. What's your systems? What's your tools? Who's involved? How are you going to request this data from your business? And are you using any EPR specific external tools to help you with this? The second one is teaming. You need to find which representatives in your organization are going to be participating in this annual process. We've found that, smaller teams with super clear roles make the most sense. You need IT compliance, which is sometimes your sustainability team, your finance team, supply chain, and sometimes external parties make sense as well with expertise to help you, figure it out and what to do. Processes and procedures. You need a clear RACI on this. It doesn't have to be RACI, but the roles and responsibilities and when needs to be super clear to work out your cadence of reporting and what systems you're going to use. And finally, your strategy or your packaging strategy, where and how to optimize your packaging. Um, what is the business case for making changes, whether that's reduction or shifting to another material or something else to optimize either your packaging or your fees or whatever your goals are. You need to be thinking about what's the business case for that. Oftentimes, external support beyond compliance reporting is super helpful. I mean, these might mean consultants, this might mean tools, but it also might be packaging partners or retailer partners. Like, who else do you need to be talking to figure out how your strategy is going to work? And then you need a program plan of how you're going to implement it, what you're going to do when, who's going to manage it. And with that, I'll talk a little bit about your program plan and how to think about that. So there's three main areas. You need your operational execution. How are you going to collect the data? How are you going to report? You need your packaging strategy of what you're going to do, what you're going to change, and then making reductions, whether that's changes to other formats, lightweighting, other things that you want to be doing to optimize your packaging, minimize your fees, and doing the things that meet your company's goals. So in operational execution, you need these scalable internal tracking systems. You might have systems set up. You might need external tools. Figure it out for the first couple of jurisdictions, and then start to extend that across borders and EPR schemes. We covered earlier how there are 7 or 8 additional states working on laws. Like, this needs to be figured out now so that you have something that you can scale. Your packaging strategy, you'll need to figure out what the quick wins are. What are you going to do in the short term? Who are your partners? How's your supply chain involved in this? How is your governance structure? You need to set up long-term governance and decision-making, ongoing strategy evaluation. Just like anything else that matters in a business, like, you need to start thinking about this through some of those same lenses. And then making the reductions, especially for the California stuff, but also in other jurisdictions. What are your quick wins? What's your long-term foundation for making changes? Because of the rules in California, you might want to think about pilots of like new packaging or types or refill systems or elimination alternatives. Maybe you pilot those in California and then move them out to other areas as well. This is what we're seeing with most of the companies that we're doing business with. Um, Typically, there's somebody who hasn't done it before because EPR in the US is new. Like, there aren't that many experts within companies on this. Somebody's learning about EPR. What's the law? How's it different? Um, what data do you need to collect? Then they'll start collecting data. And that might come from an ERP system. It might come from vendor RFIs. It might come from various spreadsheets or your financial system. You start to consolidate it, then you submit it. You run into some complexities on the format of that submission, which I'll get to in a second, but oftentimes the same packaging in different jurisdictions is reported in different categories. So there's a layer of, kind of data complexity that you need to start thinking about. This repeats annually in every jurisdiction. So you really need a program to manage the compounding risk, cost, and complexity. This is one of the examples of that data complexity. So this chart is crosswalking California and Oregon. For the same packaging, they're categorized different ways in different states. If it's green here, it's the same. If it's red here, it's different. So just one example from a subset of the categories of one of the complexities that you need to be able to challenge. You need to be able to handle and surmount the challenge. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sebastian, who can talk to us a little bit about, what PCX is doing and, what ways that we might be able to help.
Thanks, Russell. And thanks, everybody. I already see some great questions that have been posted and that are flowing in. Keep them coming. I'm just going to take a couple more minutes to discuss a little bit of how PCX is helping and partnering with our partners to address EPR compliance and the broader action plans around that. And then we'll hit on the Q&A, and Lise will help facilitate that part of the discussion. So for starters, Lise already gave a little bit of an introduction to PCX, but the way we describe ourselves again is as a plastic responsibility platform. And what does that really mean? There are really 3 pillars to what we bring to our partners in order to drive plastic responsibility. At the top, this is the one I'll talk most about in the context of EPR, is our responsibility intelligence platform. And this is a combination of our expertise, our insights, and our SaaS software tool that is highly scalable and leverageable for helping you with your EPR reporting, data consolidation, et cetera. We'll talk about that in a moment. But fundamentally, this is about overall organizational alignment, driving better outcomes at lower cost, and ensuring that you can predict the cost to the business and minimize those costs to the business. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But alongside that, sorry, go back for a moment. There are actually two other pillars that are really critical because we don't just do advisory work and help you with reporting. We actually can help you to deliver impact. And there's even a question which we'll come back to in the Q&A around how do we deal with the PCR challenge? Well, one of the ways we help with that is, as mentioned, we have partners in 15 countries around the world who are collecting plastic waste and helping to generate recycled material that is certified and traceable. And so we can also help you get access to supply. For example, if you are trying to increase the percentage of PCR that is in your packaging, we can help you source that material in a very traceable and responsible way at reasonable cost. The other pillar here is our recovery marketplace. You see the number on the left. We are, by all rights, by far the largest in the world in terms of driving verifiable, tangible impact in terms of the collection, the responsible collection on global standards of plastic waste and responsible processing of that plastic waste around the world. And you see some of the partners that we work with in all three of these pillars. So let's talk about this challenge. Russell went there. This picture is sort of our best visual representation of what all of you are going through right now, especially given the complexity of EPR laws around the world, especially given the complexity of the data that you're having to manage, and then the complexity in the organization of who's responsible for all of this. There is typically not an organization that was preconceived and pre-designed to manage EPR compliance for packaging. You are not alone if that is what you are dealing with. I spent 20 years in management consulting, and some of the most impactful work we did was helping companies navigate complexity and to reorient themselves, the change management, the accountabilities, elevating it to leadership so that the leadership team understands the costs, the risks, the ways to make really good strategic decisions about the business. And all of that needs to be put in place in order to manage this on an ongoing basis in a cost-effective and efficient manner. So how do we do that? Let's move forward. So PCX has our responsibility intelligence platform, and many people will talk about, oh, a software platform, and absolutely, we're very proud that we have a SaaS platform that you can have access to that organizes all your data and does some great reporting, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. But the real special sauce here is the combination of, I mentioned at the very beginning, the fact that we have global policy expertise. We are heavily engaged with policymakers and even PROs around the world and in the US. We are seeing not only what is there now, hopefully you saw some of that from Russell's presentation, but also what is coming and even helping to shape some of that policy. And we do that in partnership with our friends at PCX Solutions, who are dedicated to that work. We have a global network of EPR analysts. We have people in Asia, Europe, and the US who help you with the organization of your data. In many cases, I've been asked the question, well, is your platform plug and play and it just automatically spits out information? The reality is anybody who tells you that that's how it works is lying. Most people have very unstructured data. Yes, you can leverage some AI tools, but there's always nuance and there's always the need to have leveraged low-cost resources that understand this and have done it 1,000 times over. And we provide that scalable access to those resources as well as the platform itself. And then on the platform, if you go to the next page, We can go into great detail with anybody who's interested. We have a great demonstration of the platform. We can even ingest some of your sample data to show you how it manifests in the platform in terms of bringing visibility at the SKU level, at the business unit level, at the component level in different categories of packaging materials, translating that into the fees that you will be exposed to by jurisdiction, whether it's Colorado, Oregon, California, you name it. And we're constantly updating that data whenever new announcements are made so that it is accurate and up to date. It generates the reporting you need for compliance. You are required to submit it, but we can generate those reports for you. We work hand in hand with you, with our analysts and our account managers working with you to ensure that you can even generate custom reports that can ultimately then also help you with making informed strategic decisions about, for example, how to prioritize different source reduction alternatives, build scenarios on how it would affect your fees by jurisdiction if I made this change in my packaging or I did this lightweighting initiative and I had to spend this much money over this much time. Is there a business case associated with it? All of that is enabled and facilitated through the platform with the expertise that we also bring from our team. And we're happy to go into this with anybody who's interested. We'll have a QR code here in a minute where you're welcome to set up time with us to go through it. So with that, I think we should take the remainder of the time here to shift to the Q&A, and maybe Lise, you wanna walk us through that.
Sure. Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, we have a number of questions coming in and 7 minutes left, so we'll have to be judicious in our choices. So here's one, which I think will be of interest to most people. So it has to do with the idea that EPR solves for the supply side, but references the fact that the industry is seeing a lot of headwinds with, record-breaking PCR imports, particularly on the PET side. And the question is basically, given that EPR solves for the supply side, how do we solve for the demand side?
Yeah, and this is, I hinted at it a little bit, and Russell, you can pile on here in a moment. I hinted at it a little bit earlier, which is part of why we also, as part of our offerings, focus on impact and solutions for this, which is one of the struggles is, and we're seeing the news all over in Europe and the US of recycling plants being shut down because they can't be sustained, or the cost of PCR being so much higher than that of virgin plastic. There is currently not a scaled set of solutions for alternative materials in PCR at the level it needs to be. I'm going to avoid getting on my soapbox too much here, but we are huge advocates for the need to have regulation and market-based mechanisms work in concert to deliver scalable outcomes that are economically attractive to all participants in the value chain. And that is nowhere more true than in the PCR environment. I always use the analogy of renewable energy, where 15, 20 years ago, everybody said solar and wind will never be able to compete with fossil fuels, and the supply is too limited, it's seasonal, it's too expensive, the infrastructure costs too much. Well, guess where we are now, right? Lower cost, more volume of energy being produced in renewables than in fossil fuels. We can do the same thing here, but we need the right combination of regulation and market-based mechanisms to get us there. So I'm not answering your question in the here and now as much, but there are short-term solutions and we can help with that. I don't know, Russell, if you wanted to pile on.
No, I think you covered it. That was great. Let's maybe move on to the next question.
Okay. So the next question really has to do with the idea of figuring out if your business is an obliged company under US EPR and how people can know for sure. For example, is an exporter responsible for EPR reporting or an importer? And connected to that, like which types of businesses do you find are surprised to learn that EPR applies to them?
Sure, I'll take this one. So in terms of is it an exporter or importer, we go back to that hierarchy. It's typically the brand owner in most cases. If it's a place where it's, maybe a non-branded item and there is no brand, that's clearly the person. It's the party that's making the financial decision to bring the packaging into the market. So that can be, decided and disaggregated and figured out on a case by case basis, but that's typically how it works. And then, Lise, what was the second part of that question?
Well, I do ever find that there's some businesses that are surprised to learn that EPR applies to them.
Yeah, it's typically smaller, maybe mid-sized businesses. Every large business that is working in single-use packaging is pretty aware that this is happening. CAA was founded by a group of large businesses to, help bring some clarity on how these laws are going to be implemented. A lot of times, it's the mid-level companies. They don't have anybody tracking this. It's news to them. But I can't pick out, a specific sector that is like more or less likely to know that they're obliged.
Okay. And last question is quite specific. And I think I might just read this one because it's very detailed. So the question is, my understanding is that only the PRO, the CAA, is legally obligated to meet the source reduction targets. How do you expect the CAA to enforce individual producer reduction targets apart from malice fee amounts? While malice fees can be high and certainly a disincentive, I feel like this will be a major challenge for CAA to meet those reduction targets if individual producers are not legally obligated.
Sure, I can take that one. Um, while SB 54 specifically, it sounds like a California question, is on the requirements on the PRO. The PRO has a legal ability to enforce this with its members, and the legislation requires companies to be members. So there isn't really a legal way out of these source reduction requirements. I actually spent some time last week at a conference in New York with a bunch of attorneys, like talking about this, and the general consensus in the room was register now, start compliance, and if there's lobbying efforts or things that change the laws in the future, that's great, but you don't want to be behind the eight ball, having to go back and do back fees or anything like that. So there's not really a clear way for a producer that doesn't want to participate in source reduction to, get out of it if they're doing business in California.
Okay. I think that we don't have time for any more questions because we're coming up on the hour. I'll try and squeeze one last one in, which is someone's asking if there's no immediate penalty for not complying in the early phases, why should companies take US EPR seriously right now?
Companies will have to comply. Eventually, they will be found either by the PRO or by the state regulators. And when that happens, there will be back penalties, both penalties, and you're still responsible for whatever EPR fees would have been in prior years. And we outlined this on one of the slides. I mean, there's reputational, there's market access, there's a bunch of penalties. There's not really a good, legal strategy to like just try to be invisible. Some companies will definitely try, but when it becomes more mainstream, like it is in Europe, everyone's going to have to go back and like you're not
And just and
skipping.
I would just say, put yourself in the position of the regulators that are putting these laws in place. It is in their best interest to show that they are enforcing that law in order for the law to remain credible. And so they will be in enforcement mode. You can always make that business decision to take that risk, but most of the people we've talked to, as Russell referred to, even the attorneys are saying not worth it.
Okay. Okay. On that note, I think we're going to wrap for now. Thank you all for attending. If anybody wants to dive more deeply into EPR, into source reduction, both in California and globally, do sign up for our next webinar, which is happening in a couple of weeks on February 17th. And in the meantime, thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a good rest of your days. Thank you.
Thank you.